السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسرنا أن نبدأ الجلسة الثالثة اليوم مؤتمر اليوم، ورئيس الجلسة الأب ألدي تومسون، المتحدثون الأب بول هايندل من كنيسة الروم الكاثوليك، الأب كاميرون من الكنيسة الإنجيلية، والأب جون فيليب من كنيسة مارتون. فليتفضلوا على المسرح.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
We are very pleased to be here to continue our conversation from this morning. Again, we convey our thanks to His Highness Sheikh Mabaran bin Mubarak Al Nahyan, and we would like to continue discussing the subjects of how do we begin to dialogue in the United Arab Emirates. With me this afternoon are the Roman Catholic Bishop for South Arabia, Bishop Paul Hinder. Bishop Paul Hinder is the bishop to one of the largest Roman Catholic congregations outside of the Catholic world. St. Mary Church in Dubai is home to many thousands of worshippers, and just this weekend during the Holy Week of Easter, I was just learning we had about 50,000 worshippers pass through in one day in his church here in Abu Dhabi. And then on my left, I welcome Pastor Cameron Aronson. Pastor Cameron comes from the legacy left behind from the early American missionaries who built the hospital in Al Ain with the Evangelical Alliance Mission. And he is the leader of the American Evangelical Church in Abu Dhabi. But it's not just an American church, it's a very international community. What we're going to talk about this afternoon is we're going to talk about what is it like to be a Christian leader in the nation of the United Arab Emirates. And I'm going to invite them to share their experiences and also to share their thoughts on how they feel they can develop in Christian-Muslim dialogue from their perspective. And I'd like to begin with Bishop Paul Hinder.
Thank you. Praise be to God and Your Excellencies, respected hearers. I'm happy to be here and to speak to you during a few minutes. I am a resident in Abu Dhabi since 10 years when I was appointed bishop here in Abu Dhabi for all the Catholics in the region, originally for the whole peninsula except Kuwait, and since 3 years after a rearrangement by the Holy See, I have the southern 3 countries, United Arab Emirates, Sultanate of Oman, and the Republic of Yemen. It's important to see a little bit connected what we have discussed this morning, the link between religious dialogue or religion and economy. Actually, we followed the economic development in the region because our presence started originally in Aden, and only later, relatively late, we came to the Gulf side because of the growing number of migrants coming to this region. It started in Bahrain, and then later it followed the development here with Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Muscat, and so on. We are a church of migrants. There are no local Christians in the Catholic Church, and of course we are composed by faithful coming from all over the world. We have in all the big parishes at least 100 nationalities, and even within the Catholic Church with different faith traditions or liturgical traditions, which is a big challenge even for the bishop and for our priests in serving these people. What is particular, I think, my experience, I would like to start with that. When I came to the Gulf, I didn't expect to be the bishop one day here, and that's why I didn't get the opportunity to learn Arabic before I came to the region. And once I was here, I was so overwhelmed by the work that I didn't get the time. And my faithful do not speak Arabic except those who are coming from Syria or from Lebanon and so on. So our common language within the church is usually English. When I came here, I noticed that we have two not separated but distinct societies. The society of the local population with their own culture and their relationship among them, and the migrants composed themselves in different ethnic communities, and we feel that also in the church. So there is relatively few dialogue between the two societies, except what we are experiencing in the daily life when we have to go to the ministry or to the offices or to the hospital or I don't know where. But in the daily life, there is little real communication between the two worlds. And that makes also the interfaith dialogue more difficult, besides the language question we have to address. According to me, we have to proceed in a more pragmatic way, that we learn more one about the other. I think there is a big problem between the different religions anyway. Now, generally, people don't know what the others believe. They don't know what the others practice. I think, for example, only few of our members have ever been in a mosque. And maybe vice versa, that only few have ever been in a Catholic church of the Muslims. So sometimes simply we do not know what are the others doing and how do they live. And I think it starts with that. It's like in a family, once you have seen the house of the neighbor, it was mentioned this morning, you have immediately another relationship with the other. Of course, you respect the privacy, but you have an idea. I remember years ago, I had the unique chance once in Yemen to enter a house of a local family who had this openness and generosity to show me that. It gives you immediately another approach to the world of the people who live there. If you remain outside, you have always the question, what's going on? And I think between the religions, there is something similar. And I would start with that, to know better, to respect one another in a deep sense, because we have not to do, that was also mentioned this morning, primarily with politics. We have to deal with faith. Different faiths, but it's a faith question. The relationship with God. Muslims, in their way, we Christians, or for me as a Catholic, we in our way, but at the very end we have to do with the same God, with the same origin. And that to learn and to discover and to respect, and not only to learn to know, but probably also to learn from the way the other is approaching God and how he or she prays. And there we should start with the education of the youth, that we avoid everything that is based simply on prejudices, on old quarrels of the history, but to give the way free to learn in an authentic way what do the others believe and how do they treat it. Because the common needs basically are the same for all human beings. We want to worship God. We want security and peace in our daily life. And that is independent if we are Christians or Muslims or Hindu or whatever. We want security and peace for our families, for our societies. We want justice. It has been mentioned also this morning. We want the dignity of each human being, that we be respected in our individual lives, respected in our life, physical life, respected in our intellectual life. And that is independent of the different faith. The answer may be in another color, but the basic need of the human person is the same. And then on this way, I think there's possibility to discover or to rediscover better the common ground, as it has been mentioned this morning, which leads us also to the mutual respect. Respect means that I always look what are the consequences for the other. I look backwards around me, and that helps me to widen my own horizon and to respect the needs of the other. And that is true in religion, it's true in a family. We have, as a church, coming to the region here, of course, a development in the relationship also between Catholic Church and the different countries. There is diplomatic relationship between the Holy See, the Vatican, and the UAE. And of course, this has consequences in the mutual relationship. One of the questions we may have, and to clarify, as a Catholic Church, and I think it's true for the other Christian communities and churches equally, with the development of the legislation in the country, the old traditions which worked mainly on an oral basis before we had proper legislation, because the Catholic Church was here before the already existent in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai, before the United Arab Emirates were constituted as a federation. Nowadays, things have become a little bit more complicated. What is the legal status of the church as such? And that has practical consequences, sometimes to the daily life, just to open a bank account. Earlier there was no problem. Nowadays you are asked, who are you? And it has never been really defined. So it's not a question now of interreligious dialogue, but it's a question, how can we situate ourselves in the fast developing society of the United Arab Emirates and in the other countries. And there I'm grateful if we can help each other to find the right way. It's a question of dialogue among us and within the Christian communities, but I think it's equally a question of dialogue between the local society and our migrant society we constitute. To finish, simply, I'm here since 10 years exactly. I arrived on the 25th January 2004 here in the country. It was at the beginning a little bit a shock to be transferred from Rome here to Abu Dhabi, but I can tell you I felt with every day when I was here more at home, and not the last because there were possibilities also to relate with local people. One of them, of course, is my friend Sheikh Nayan, but also with other people like Dr. Hashemi and many others who helped me to feel respected myself, to feel accepted. Never in these 10 years here in the Emirates I would have been insulted or attacked. I always was really received with respect, and I think that's also a good testimony and witness for the style and the culture of the local society, and I thank you for that. Yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Paul. Pastor Cameron, I'm now going to invite you to share about your experience of the church and observations about Christian-Muslim relations.
Thank you, and I just want to again greet all of you and thank you for the chance to participate in this discussion. I've actually been in the United Arab Emirates since 1990, so this is my 24th year. So I've seen much of the progress and growth over half of the history of this nation I have had the chance to share. So we came here with our two boys, and now they're grown in the U.S. with their own families. So we have been a part of the UAE for a long time. I would echo what the bishop has just said as far as the welcome we have received here and the cooperation we have received from the authorities. The evangelical churches in many ways represent what we sometimes call the free churches in other parts of the world. We're Christians who are not associated with any of the hierarchical or the churches with a larger structure. We don't have any outside the UAE that we relate to. We are simply Christians who have come here as people of faith, and we have found each other and worship together. And the evangelical movement came first, as has been said, with the Oasis Hospital and the Doctors Kennedy and Dr. Latifa and others who were part of the early history of this country. And so we feel like we have some deep roots here and have enjoyed the hospitality and the graciousness of this country. When I think of the whole issue of relationships on a large scale, I go back to the words of Jesus when he was asked, what's the most important commandment? And he said, well, the most important commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he said, and the second commandment is like to it, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And that summarizes all of human life, both in the vertical dimension and our relationship with Almighty God, and then on the horizontal relationship and our relationship with one another. On a religious basis, there are some significant differences in terms of how we view God, how we understand Him, and the revelation that we take as authoritative and how we follow that revelation to know God. So I'm not going to make light of those differences and pretend they don't exist. They do exist, and they are very profound. On the other hand, when Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, One of the men who heard him say that came and said, well, who is my neighbor? And, who do I have to love, basically? And that's when Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, of how this man who came from a despised tribe was the one who was the hero and who showed grace and love to this unknown person that he met and found wounded along the road. And so by that story, Jesus was really teaching us that every man is our neighbor. Whether they share all of my convictions on the vertical relationship with God or not, he is still my neighbor. Whether I recognize him, know him, and have known him for long, he is still my neighbor. And that model of tolerance and respect and love and care for one another on the horizontal relationship is the one that we can use to build a tolerant society, a society that respects one another. And I have found in my own church, we are a church, we meet, we have English is a common language, but there's people from 60 different nationalities that worship with us on a Friday morning. And we come, in some cases, from some quite different Christian traditions. And yet I have preached to these congregations for 24 years without any significant debate or battle over those differences. And I have found that the way that we're able to do that is when I know I'm approaching a subject in which there are some significant debate, I simply start with a statement of mutual respect and say, I recognize that this issue I'm about to talk about is one on which sincere people disagree. And yet I just want to share with you what I believe the Bible teaches, or what my thoughts are on the subject. And simply by respecting the other person as a person of goodwill and of thoughtfulness, and we may come to a point of agreeing to disagree, but we can disagree without being disagreeable. And that has preserved our Christian unity on a smaller scale where the differences are not so significant. But I believe those same principles can preserve a unity of life on a larger scale, even though the differences in belief may be more significant, more dramatic, and allow us to continue to dialogue in good faith. Not to say we're all alike or we all agree, but we can respect one another as we discuss our differences. And I think the economic implications of that are significant, very significant. It means that we can work together, we can learn from one another, we can take what each culture and so on has to give. And I think the contributions of the churches, for example, to the economic development of the UAE is that people who are content, people who are well cared for spiritually, make better workers. They work harder, they work better, and they in turn contribute to the society. If people are fearful, if they are acting out of intimidation, they don't work as well. And so a tolerant society brings out the best in all levels of a society. And so that's not our purpose, but it is a side effect of ministering to the spiritual needs of people, because those who have their relationship with God strong and strengthened also are going to be more productive and better in the relating to one another on the horizontal level of neighbor to neighbor. And so we have found the UAE to be a wonderful place to practice these principles, and we are very grateful for the opportunities we've had and the cooperation we've had, both from the very highest levels of government authority as well as all the different levels as well. And I would just echo what was said at the end by the bishop, and that is that we do have every desire to live in complete conformity with the laws and practices of the UAE, but sometimes we're not sure where those laws are in terms of the churches and the regulations, and so right now we need some help in trying to sort out, what are those regulations banking-wise and so on, so that we can conform to them. We're not a club, we're not a business, we're something else, but what we are is very important to our people, but also we believe to the society of the UAE as a whole. And so that's part of facilitating the economic implications, so to speak, of a society like the UAE. But again, after 24 years of living here, this country is very much close to my heart, and we're very grateful for all that it has meant to us and the opportunity we've had to be a part of its history.
Thank you very much, Pastor Cameron. So some of the themes that were picked up is from Bishop Paul, a reminder that the Christian community of the United Arab Emirates is an expatriate church, an immigrant church. There are no visible Emirati Christians in this nation, so the church exists solely for the immigrant community. And that creates a dichotomous society, a society of us and them, and that in turn creates a sort of a fear and sometimes a separation which is unintended. And the way to overcome that, as Bishop Paul underlined, is to overcome the ignorance of one another, to recognize our common needs. And a word which Pastor Cameron also mentioned is the word respect. And the Grand Mufti of Dubai also underlined the importance for mutual respect in our relationship with one another. And finally, again, along with Pastor Cameron and Bishop Paul, it's a recognition that we want to be, as a Christian community, legally abiding citizens of this nation as we continue to develop. And the history of the Church in the United Arab Emirates began long before the UAE even was the UAE. The gracious personality of President Zayed allowed the churches to develop. He gave them land, and we've kind of grown up together with the United Arab Emirates. And in doing so, we kind of not really found our place yet in the legal development of this nation. So a plea there from both speakers about helping us to be good citizens by knowing our place, our legal framework within the society of the United Arab Emirates. Pastor Cameron also emphasized the theological basis for Christian involvement in Christian-Muslim dialogue, and that is on the passage of loving God and loving our neighbour. Thank you. We're now going to have a question and answer time. Are there any questions from the floor? Can I have the question in English, please? Mr. Dr. Yusuf.
شكرا سيد رئيس الجلسة. I will deliver my speech in Arabic, so I appreciate you can put the
Okay.
هي حتى ينتهي البيشوب من وضع السماعة. أود أن أعلق، ليس لدي سؤال، أفسر من وجهة نظري الشخصية المسألة الخلافية التي أثارها بيشوب بول هايندر حول وجود عالمين منفصلين في الإمارات، عالم الكنائس أو عالم المجتمع الإسلامي. دعني أختلف معك في هذا التفسير. الحوار ليس بالضرورة أن يتم بين رأس الكنيسة هنا كبيشوب، كمطران، كقسيس، وبين مفتي، أو لأن ليس في الإسلام، يعني عندما تقول مسجد لا تتحاور الكنيسة مع مسجد أو مع خطيب هذا المسجد. حوارك أنت هو حوار الحياة، حوار التعايش. نحن كمجتمع إماراتي يضم المواطن المسلم ويضم أيضا وافدين عاملين هنا بعقائد مختلفة، بمعتقدات مختلفة، بمذاهب مختلفة. هذا الحوار يتم يوميا، الجار مع جاره والموظف مع رئيسه، وفي داخل العمل هناك مجتمع مختلط، في المصنع، في المكتب، في الشركة. هذا هو حوار دائم يومي، أفهم وتفهمني، نفهم عاداتك وتفهم عاداتي وطبائعي، وتشاهدني وأنا أصلي. لكن لا أحد يذهب إلى الكنيسة أثناء صلاتك أو موعظتك، مثلما لا تذهب إلى المسجد لتسمع خطبتي أو أنا وأنا أصلي. الحوار بالنسبة فهمي له الآن في مجتمع الإمارات، طالما لا يوجد مواطن مسيحي أو هندوسي أو بوذي أو يعني كمواطن، لكن هذا الحوار يتم مع هذا الذي يعمل شريكا معي في تجارتي. أدخل بيته ويدخل بيتي، أتناول غذائي معه. الطلبة المسيحيين من جنسيات أوروبية وآسيوية في جامعاتنا العديدة يجلس بجوار طالب مسلم وطالب مسيحي بمعتقداته المختلفة، فيجري بينهم حوار يومي فيما يتعلق بالحياة، بالحرية، بالعدالة، بغير ذلك. هذا هو نوع الحوار. عندما تقول، يعني لا أدري كيف كانت الفهم في هذا. أنا حضرت معكم سيادة البيشوب في مجلس حواري للشيخ علي الهاشمي خلال، وأعتقد عدد منكم شارك في ذلك، في بعض البيوت مجالس علمية أسبوعية. يحضر معنا من الكنيسة القبطية، وحضرتكم بيشوب حضرتم معنا، وكنا نتناول قضايا تهم الناس، تهم العلاقات بين البشر. نتحدث عن قضايا أبعد خارج حتى عن مجتمع الإمارات في هذا، وكنتم تشاركون في هذه المجالس أيضا مثل هذا الحوار. هناك أيضا رعاية من مسؤولين إلى احتفالات هذه الكنائس ومشاركتكم احتفالاتكم ومناسباتكم في هذا. هذا نوع من الحوار أيضا. لكن على المستوى، وهنا أنا أذكر منذ الثمانينات كان هناك حوار مثلا بين الإسلام والمسيحية، يتولى ديوان ولي العهد، ولي عهد أبو ظبي، وجاء الأمير شارلز وهو من المهتمين في مسألة الحوار الإسلامي المسيحي، وجاء عدد من رجال الكنائس في أوروبا أيضا، وتحاورنا طوال هذه الفترة، فترة الثمانينات والتسعينات. وأيضا في برامجنا المختلفة الإعلامية وغير الإعلامية نقدم هذه الرؤية الإسلامية، ونقدم رؤى وكتاب وعلماء يكتبون في صحافتنا وفي إعلامنا عن الرؤى، سواء كانت يكتب فيها مسيحي ويكتب فيها أمريكي ويكتب فيها هندي، ونتناقل. هذا حوار جاري. لكن أن يكون هناك مؤسسة. الآن قبل أسبوع تم عقد منتدى للسلم في المجتمعات الإسلامية قبل أسبوع، وتقرر في هذا أن ينشأ مركز للحوار مع الاديان المختلفة في هذا الموضوع. كثير من علماء إماراتيين وأكاديميين شاركوا في الحوار الإسلامي المسيحي في عدد من العواصم الأوروبية. أنا من الناس الذين شاركوا، ومعنا عليه رحمة الله عز الدين إبراهيم، شاركنا في الحوار الإسلامي المسيحي في مدريد الذي رعته المملكة العربية السعودية، ملك السعودية في ذلك الوقت وملك إسبانيا. وفي السويد منذ 3 شهور كنا أيضا في حوار مع الكنائس الدنماركية، وربما بعد أيام أو أسابيع قادمة هناك حوار مع مجلس الكنائس العالمية في هذا الموضوع. وأسسنا عدد من شخصيات من الإمارات. تم تأسيس فريق عربي للحوار الإسلامي المسيحي في بيروت في 1995 يضم مسيحيين ومسلمين ودروز وغير ذلك، ونقوم بمعالجة كثير من الإشكاليات المسيحية الإسلامية في مصر والسودان ولبنان وفي أوروبا أيضا. كثير من هذه الأوضاع، فنحن لسنا في عالمين منفصلين. ربما مؤسسة الكنيسة والمسجد لا يقابلها المسجد في المعنى الذي نقصده، لكن كأفراد أنتم رجال دين، وهناك رجال دين مسلمين، لكن ليس بالمعنى الذي نفهمه بالكنيسة. لأننا نستطيع، أنا لست رجل دين، لكنني قرأت العهد القديم والعهد الجديد، وكتبت أطروحتي في الدكتوراه في الأصولية المسيحية في هذا الموضوع. بالتالي في أشخاص قد يهتموا في مسألة هذا الحوار، في آخرين رؤيتهم للمسيحية لثقافة مشتركة، ثقافة تقبل الآخر. يعني هذا ما نسعى إليه في التعليم، في الإعلام، في العلاقات البشرية. نحتاج دائما إلى أن نفهم بعضنا البعض. مثلما هناك مسلمين لا يعرفوا ما هي الديانة المسيحية بمتفرعاتها المختلفة، هناك قطاع ضخم من المسيحيين لا يعرفوا جوهر الإسلام، ربما يعرفوا تصرفات وسلوكيات سيئة لبعض أتباع المسلمين، تصرفات وممارسات لا علاقة لها بالدين، لكن ممارسات أشخاص، فيعتقدوا أن هذا هو الإسلام. هذه الصور الستيريوتايب اللي نحن بحوارنا بحاجة إلى تصحيحها. يعني أرجو أن تكون فكرتي واضحة، ويعني مع اعتزازي كثيرا لرجال الدين الذين التقينا فيهم في أبو ظبي، والتي أصفهم دائما بأنهم متواضعون لا يستكبرون، وهي من أبرز الصفات التي يتصف فيها، التي وصفها الإسلام للرهبان ورجال الدين المسيحي. شكرا.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yusuf, for your comment. I think that brings us now to the end of this session. The time is 3 o'clock, and we now have a short break for coffee before our final session. Thank you very much, Bishop Paul, and thank you very much, Pastor Cameron.